never shared a bed.
Then share mine forever.
Freezing to death wasn't part of her escape plan. Going by the alias Rose, the runaway bride was supposed to belong to a ruthless silver baron. But when a rugged, solitary mountain man unearthed her from the Bitterroot snowdrifts, her desperate flight turned into an unpredictable, dangerous fight for survival. The winter of 1,883 inches, the Bitterroot Range was not merely a season, it was a ruthless executioner. Simon Boone knew this better than any man alive. A mountain man by trade and a hermit by choice, Simon had spent the last decade carving a solitary existence out of the unforgiving wilderness. He was a man of leather and fur, with eyes the color of a stormy timberline and a beard that hid the scars of a life left behind in the chaotic, sprawling towns of the lower valleys. On a twilight afternoon, with the sky bruising into a heavy, ominous purple, Simon was running his trap lines. The temperature was dropping fast, the air growing so brittle it burned his lungs with every inhalation. He was about to turn back toward his secluded cabin when his lead mule, a stubborn beast named Barnaby, suddenly halted, flattening its ears against the howling gale. Simon squinted through the blinding whiteout. There, half buried in a snowdrift at the base of a towering ponderosa pine, was a shock of unnatural color. Deep, crushed emerald velvet. He waded through the waist-deep powder, his Sharps rifle slung over his broad shoulder. As he brushed away the accumulating snow, his breath hitched. It was a woman. She was crumpled in a heap, her porcelain skin tinged with a dangerous, deathly blue. She was dressed for a high society parlor in Boston, not the savage peaks of the Montana Territory. A thin silk dress clung to her shivering frame beneath the ruined velvet cloak, and her delicate leather boots were frozen solid. Simon stripped off his heavy buffalo hide coat without a second thought, wrapping it tightly around her fragile body. She was light as a handful of dry kindling when he lifted her into his arms. "Hold on, little bird," Simon muttered into the wind, though he doubted she could hear him. Her pulse was a faint, erratic flutter against his wrist. The trek back to the cabin was a brutal test of endurance, but Simon was driven by a primal urgency. When he finally kicked open the heavy oak door of his sanctuary, the embers in the stone hearth were still glowing. He worked with methodical speed, stoking the fire until it roared, bathing the single-room cabin in a fierce golden heat. He placed her on the thick, bare rug before the hearth. Knowing the danger of frostbite and hypothermia, he hesitated for only a fraction of a second before his rough hands began unfastening the frozen, ruined layers of her aristocratic clothing. He left her in her cotton chemise, wrapping her tightly in his heaviest woolen blankets. He heated stones by the fire, wrapping them in cloth and placing them at her feet and hands. For 2 days, the blizzard raged outside, laying siege to the cabin. For 2 days, Simon kept a vigil, forcing warm bone broth past her pale lips, watching as the deadly blue faded from her skin, replaced by a feverish flush. On the third night, as the wind finally began to die down to a mournful whimper, her eyes fluttered open. They were wide, terrified, and the color of pale morning sky. She scrambled backward, clutching the rough wool blankets to her chest, her back hitting the log wall of the cabin. "Where am I? Who are you? Don't touch me!" Her voice was ragged, torn from a dry throat. Simon sat back on his heels, raising his calloused hands slowly to show he meant no harm. "Easy now. You're safe. Name's Simon Boone. Found you freezing to death down by Miller's Creek. You're in my cabin." She stared at him, her chest heaving as she took in his imposing size, the buckskins, the intimidating hunting knife strapped to his thigh. But beneath the wild exterior, she saw a quiet, steady calm in his gray eyes. "I am. Abigail," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Abigail Prescott." "Well, Miss Prescott," Simon said, standing up and moving to the cast-iron stove to pour a cup of chicory coffee, "you're a long way from anywhere that calls for emerald velvet. You running from the law, or a man?" Abigail flinched. The bluntness of his question pierced right through her defenses. She looked down at her hands, trembling against the blanket. "A man," she confessed, the shame and terror thick in her throat. "Josiah Sterling." Simon paused, the tin cup halfway to his mouth. Even up in the high country, the name Josiah Sterling carried weight. He was a ruthless silver baron from Helena, a man who bought up land, politicians, and people with equal sociopathic ease. "Sterling," Simon repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "He's not a man who takes kindly to losing his property." "I am not his property!" Abigail fired back, a sudden spark of defiance lighting up her pale features. But just as quickly, the fire died, replaced by overwhelming despair. At least, I refused to be. He ruined my father, bought up the banknotes on our ranch, poisoned our water lines, until we had nothing left. The only way he would forgive the debt was if I married him. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. I fled the night before the wedding. I paid a stagecoach driver to take me as far west as he could, but the axle snapped in the storm. He rode off on the remaining horse to find help and never came back. I tried to walk. Simon walked over and handed her the warm tin cup. His large, rough fingers briefly brushed against hers. The contrast between his scarred, weather-beaten skin and her soft, trembling hands was stark. "You're a brave woman, Abigail Prescott," Simon said softly. "Foolish to walk into a mountain blizzard in dancing shoes, but brave all the same." Abigail took a sip of the bitter brew, the warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in months, she looked at a man and did not feel the immediate, suffocating weight of fear. Instead, looking up at Simon Boone, she felt a dangerous, unfamiliar sense of safety. The blizzard finally broke on the 5th morning, leaving behind a world buried in blinding, silent white. The isolation of the cabin, snowed in under drifts that reached the windowsills, forced Simon and Abigail into an intimate, domestic rhythm. In the civilized world, they would never have crossed paths. She was the refined daughter of a wealthy rancher, educated in the East, taught French, piano, and the delicate art of high society navigation. He was a man who knew the language of the wind, the migration patterns of elk, and the violent, swift justice of the frontier. Yet, in the confined space of the 20 by 20 log cabin, the superficial rules of society melted away. Simon found himself lingering in the mornings, watching her brush out her long, dark hair by the firelight. He noticed the way her delicate nose crinkled when she tried his strong, bitter coffee, and the quiet strength she possessed as she insisted on helping him mend his snowshoes or skin the rabbits he caught in his nearby snares. Abigail, in turn, found herself fascinated by the mountain man. She watched the fluid, powerful grace of his movements as he chopped wood, the terrifying strength in his arms offset by the surprising gentleness with which he handled a wounded barn owl that had taken shelter in his lean-to. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was the truth, unvarnished and raw. One evening, as the fire crackled and spat sap, the silence between them grew heavy, charged with a tension that had been slowly building for days. Simon was sharpening his hunting knife, the rhythmic shh, shh of the whetstone filling the room. Abigail was sitting on the edge of the cabin's single, large bed, a heavy wooden frame piled high with thick furs and quilts. Until now she had slept there alone, while Simon insisted on taking his bedroll to the hard wooden floor near the door. "You can't keep sleeping on the floor, Simon," Abigail said softly, breaking the silence. "Your back must be agonizing, and the drafts under the door are freezing." Simon paused, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. The firelight cast deep shadows across the sharp planes of his face. "I'm accustomed to the cold, Abigail. You need the rest." "I am fully recovered," she insisted, pulling the fur blanket tighter around her shoulders. "It's absurd. The bed is large enough. We are entirely snowed in, cut off from the world. There is no society here to judge us." Simon set the knife down. He stood up slowly, his towering frame filling the small cabin. He walked toward her, his movements predatory but entirely restrained. When he stopped, he was just inches from the edge of the bed. He looked down at her, his gaze intense, stripping away the polite veneer she wore like armor. "It ain't about society's judgment, Abigail," Simon murmured, his voice a low gravel that sent a shiver down her spine. "It's about a man knowing his own limits. I ain't made of stone." Abigail's breath hitched. She looked up into his stormy gray eyes and saw the raw, burning hunger there. A hunger she was shocked to realize. She felt mirrored deep within her own chest. But alongside the sudden, fierce attraction was a paralyzing wave of anxiety. Josiah Sterling's cruel, cold hands flashed in her memory. The terrifying expectations of a wedding night she had fled into a blizzard to escape. She looked down at her hands, her voice dropping to a vulnerable, fragile whisper. "He bought me, Simon. Josiah. He spoke of me as if I were a prized mare. I was to be his wife, to perform my duties, but—" She swallowed hard, forcing the words out, exposing her deepest, most terrifying innocence. "I know nothing of men, the things they expect. I've never even shared a bed." The silence that followed was absolute, save for the crackle of the hearth. Simon stared down at the beautiful, terrified woman trembling before him. He saw the scars of her past, the fear of being owned, used, and discarded. Slowly, Simon knelt before her, bringing himself down to her eye level. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gently cupping her delicate jaw. His thumb stroked her cheekbone, a touch so tender it made her eyes flutter shut. When she opened them, the ferocity in his gaze took her breath away. It wasn't the cold, possessive glare of Josiah Sterling. It was a fierce, protective fire, a vow. "Then share mine," the mountain man whispered, his voice a rough, unwavering promise against the dying firelight. "Forever!" Before Abigail could process the weight of his words, the sudden, violent sound of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon outside, shattering the stillness of the mountain night. Simon was on his feet in an instant, the tender lover vanishing, replaced by the deadly frontiersman. He blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. He grabbed his Sharps rifle from the wall, his jaw set like granite. "Stay away from the windows," Simon ordered, his voice cold and hard as the ice outside. Abigail huddled back against the headboard, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Is it him?" she whispered into the dark. "Is it Josiah?" Simon peered through a crack in the heavy wooden shutters. Down in the valley, illuminated by the pale light of the rising hunter's moon, the silhouettes of 5 men on horseback were pushing their way through the deep snowdrifts, heading straight up the ridge toward the cabin. Leading them was a man holding a torch, and even from this distance, Simon recognized the heavy, swaggering gait of Deacon Miller, the most ruthless bounty hunter in the Montana Territory, a man Simon had crossed paths with many years ago. "Worse," Simon said grimly, pulling back the hammer of his rifle with a chilling metallic click. "It's the men he paid to bring you back, and they don't care if you're breathing when they do." The heavy oak shutters rattled violently as a volley of lead slammed into the thick log walls of the cabin. Splinters of wood showered the darkness inside. Simon remained perfectly still by the narrow firing slit, his breathing steady, his Sharps rifle leveled at the snowdrifts below. Abigail huddled on the floorboards, her hands pressed over her ears. The deafening roar of gunfire was a terrifying contrast to the quiet intimacy they had shared just moments before. "Boone!" a voice bellowed from the tree line. It was thick with chewing tobacco and malice. "We know you're in there! Toss the girl out, and we'll let you keep your scalp." "Josiah Sterling pays top dollar for returned property, but he ain't paying for your hide." Simon didn't answer. He waited for a break in the heavy clouds to let the moonlight illuminate the ridge. When it did, he caught the glint of a rifle barrel poking out from behind a snow-draped boulder. Simon exhaled slowly, pulled the trigger, and the Sharps roared. The heavy, .50 caliber slug tore through the crisp night air, shattering the rock and the man behind it. A scream echoed through the canyon, abruptly cut short. "That's one," Simon muttered, swiftly reloading in the pitch blackness. "You son of a bitch," Deacon Miller roared from the darkness. "Fire the lean-to! Smoke the bastard out!" Panic seized Abigail's chest. "Simon, they're going to burn us alive," she whispered, crawling toward him. "They can try," Simon replied grimly. He reached down, his large hand finding her shoulder in the dark, offering a brief, firm squeeze. "You know how to load a Winchester, Abigail?" "No," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But I can learn." Simon slid his backup repeater across the floorboards to her, followed by a heavy leather box of cartridges. "Brass end goes in first. Push 'em through the loading gate on the side until it clicks. Don't stop until it's full." As Abigail fumbled with the cold metal and heavy bullets, the sharp smell of kerosene wafted through the cracks in the walls. A moment later, a bright, unnatural orange glow flickered through the firing slits. The dry pine needles and stacked cordwood in the lean-to ignited with a ferocious whoosh. Smoke began to seep under the eaves, thick and acrid, stinging their eyes and throats. "They aren't going to wait for us to surrender," Simon said, coughing as the cabin filled with a suffocating haze. He fired 2 more blind shots into the tree line to keep the posse pinned down, then slung the rifle over his shoulder. "Grab the blankets. We're leaving." "Leaving? How? The door is surrounded." Simon moved to the center of the room, throwing aside the heavy bear rug that had been Abigail's sanctuary just days prior. Beneath it lay a trapdoor, secured by a heavy iron ring. He heaved it open, revealing a pitch-black shaft dropping into the earth. "Every trapper who values his life builds a back door," Simon coughed, the smoke now forcing them to stay low to the floor. "Root cellar connects to a drainage tunnel. Drops us out in the ravine, a quarter-mile behind the ridge. Go." "Now." Abigail didn't hesitate. She clutched the Winchester and the heavy wool blankets, swinging her legs into the cold, damp dark. Simon followed immediately after, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut just as the cabin's roof caught fire with a deafening crack. The tunnel was agonizingly cramped, smelling of wet earth and ancient frost. They crawled on their hands and knees, the earth vibrating above them as the posse continued to shoot at the burning cabin, entirely unaware their prey was slipping away beneath the snow. When they finally broke through the frozen brush at the end of the tunnel, the icy wind hit them like a physical blow. They were at the bottom of a steep ravine, shrouded in the deep shadows of the towering pines. Looking back up the mountain, the sky was painted a violent, glowing orange as Simon's home of 10 years burned to the ground. "My cabin," Simon said softly, staring at the inferno. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles jumped. "I'm so sorry," Abigail breathed, guilt washing over her. "You lost everything because of me." Simon turned his gaze from the fire to her. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes burning with an intensity that rivaled the flames. "A house is just wood and nails, Abigail. What matters is standing right in front of me." He grabbed her hand, his grip unyielding. "Now move. They'll figure out we ain't in the ashes soon enough." The trek through the Bitterroot wilderness was a nightmare of endurance. The snow in the ravine was waist-deep, untracked, and brutal. Simon broke the trail, using his massive frame to plow a path through the drifts, but the exertion was taking a devastating toll. Hours bled into the agonizing gray of false dawn. Abigail, draped in Simon's heavy buffalo coat, pushed herself past every limit she thought she possessed. The refined society girl who had fainted in drawing rooms was gone, replaced by a desperate woman fighting for her life and the life of the man pulling her through the wilderness. "Simon, wait!" Abigail gasped, grabbing his arm as they crested a small, jagged ridge. Simon stumbled, catching himself against the trunk of a dead cedar. When he turned, Abigail saw it. A dark, ugly stain spreading across the left side of his buckskin jacket, freezing into a crimson crust. A stray bullet had grazed his ribs through the log walls during the siege, and the grueling pace had torn the wound wide open. "It's nothing," he grunted, swaying slightly. "You're bleeding to death, you stubborn fool," she shot back, her fear transforming into a fierce, commanding anger. She forced him to sit against the tree. Tearing a strip of fabric from the hem of her ruined cotton chemise, she packed it tightly against the wound, tying it off with a leather strap from his pack. Her hands were covered in his blood, but they didn't shake. Simon watched her work, a faint, proud smile touching his pale lips. "You'd make a hell of a mountain wife, Abigail Prescott." "Don't speak as if this is the end," she commanded, blinking back hot tears. "We have to keep moving." "We can't," a new voice echoed through the frozen trees. Abigail spun around, raising the heavy Winchester. Standing 20 yards away, a repeating rifle resting casually on his shoulder, was Deacon Miller. 2 other armed men fanned out behind him, their horses steaming in the freezing air. They had tracked the blood trail. "Gotta admit, Boone," Deacon spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the snow. "You made us work for it. But the run's over. Put the gun down, little lady. It's too heavy for you anyway." Simon pushed himself up from the tree, standing in front of Abigail, shielding her with his wounded body. He drew the massive hunting knife from his thigh, the steel gleaming dully in the gray dawn light. You want her, Deacon? You go through me. Deacon laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Gladly. He dropped his rifle and pulled a heavy steel hatchet from his belt, stepping forward. The two men clashed in the snow like warring titans. The fight was brutal, stripped of any honor or grace. It was survival in its rawest form. Deacon swung the hatchet with lethal intent, catching Simon on the shoulder, tearing through leather and flesh. Simon roared, driving his heavy knee into Deacon's chest, knocking the air from the bounty hunter's lungs, and following through with a slashing strike of his knife that laid Deacon's cheek open to the bone. They tumbled into the deep snow, a flurry of fists, blades, and crimson. Abigail raised the Winchester, her heart pounding frantically, but they were rolling too fast. If she fired, she risked hitting Simon. Deacon managed to pin Simon down, raising the hatchet high above his head for a skull-splitting blow. "Hey!" Abigail screamed. Deacon's eyes flicked to her for a fraction of a second. It was all Simon needed. With a guttural shout, Simon drove the hilt of his hunting knife upward, sinking the blade deep into the soft hollow just beneath Deacon Miller's jaw. The bounty hunter's eyes went wide. The hatchet slipped from his grasp, and he collapsed sideways into the crimson-stained snow, dead before his body settled. The two remaining posse members leveled their rifles, ready to execute Simon where he lay. Suddenly, the deafening crack of a revolver rang out, then another. The two men dropped their rifles, screaming, clutching shattered kneecaps. Abigail stood there, the smoking Colt revolver she had pulled from Simon's pack gripped in both hands. She was breathing hard, the barrel still leveled at the writhing men. She hadn't hesitated. Simon slowly pushed himself to his feet, clutching his bleeding side, staring at her in absolute awe. But the silence that followed was broken by the slow, mocking sound of hands clapping. Emerging from the thick morning fog on a massive black thoroughbred was a figure draped in an immaculate, fur-lined cashmere coat. He looked entirely out of place in the brutal slaughter of the ravine, a ghost of high society intruding on the savage wilderness. Josiah Sterling smiled, his pale, cold eyes locking onto Abigail. "Bravo, my dear," Josiah drawled, his voice smooth as poisoned silk. Behind him, 5 more armed men rode out of the fog surrounding the ridge. "I must say I am surprised. I thought I was hunting a runaway bride, but it seems I've come to fetch a feral animal." "Put the gun down, Abigail. The wedding is back on." The morning mist clung to the bitter cold of the ravine like a funeral shroud. Josiah Sterling sat atop his magnificent black thoroughbred, a picture of aristocratic arrogance amidst the savage wilderness. His cashmere coat was immaculate, entirely untouched by the desperate, bloody struggle that had just unfolded in the snow. Abigail's hands shook, but she kept the heavy barrel of the Colt revolver leveled directly at Josiah's chest. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp bite of spent gunpowder. "I said put the gun down, my dear," Josiah repeated, his voice dropping its mock gentle tone, replacing it with the cold, grating edge of a man who was entirely used to being obeyed. "You have cost me an exorbitant amount of time and money. I had to hire half the Pinkerton National Detective Agency just to track your stagecoach route, and then employ this frontier filth," he gestured dismissively at the dead bounty hunter in the snow, "to do the actual digging. The game is over." "I am not a game, Josiah," Abigail said, her voice finding a sudden ringing clarity in the freezing air, "and I would rather let this mountain take my life than spend another second in your presence." Josiah's pale eyes narrowed, the charming facade shattered, revealing the sociopathic cruelty beneath. He spurred his horse a half-step forward. "You belong to me. Your father's debts made sure of that. If I have to drag you back to Helena, tied across the saddle of my horse, I will." He glanced at the 5 armed men forming a semicircle behind him, their rifles raised and trained on Simon. "Kill the mountain man. Leave the girl." Simon, clutching his bleeding side, didn't look at the men preparing to execute him. His stormy gray eyes were fixed high above Josiah's head. The eastern rim of the ravine was formed by a towering, sheer cliff face. At the very top, catching the first golden rays of the morning sun, was a massive, overhanging cornice of snow and ice, thousands of tons of frozen weight, precariously balanced and weakened by the morning thaw and the echoing gunshots of the morning's battle. Simon knew the bitter roots. He knew that the mountain was a living, breathing thing, and right now it was holding its breath. "Abigail," Simon said, his voice a low, urgent gravel. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes on the ridge. "When I say move, you dive into the tunnel. You don't look back." "Simon, no, I won't leave you." "Do it!" he roared. With blinding speed that defied his massive injuries, Simon dropped to his uninjured knee, snatching the Sharp's rifle from the snow where it had fallen during his fight with Deacon. He didn't aim at Josiah. He didn't aim at the hired guns. He pointed the heavy buffalo rifle straight up at the towering cliff face. He pulled the trigger. The heavy 50 caliber explosion was deafening, a booming thunderclap that slammed against the narrow rock walls of the ravine and echoed upward. The massive lead slug struck the very center of the ice cornice with a shattering crack that sounded like the earth itself splitting open. Josiah's horse reared, screaming in panic. "What are you doing, you idiot?" Josiah shouted, fighting the reins. "Shoot him!" But the men didn't shoot. They were staring upward, their faces draining of color. A deep, terrifying groan vibrated through the bedrock beneath their boots. Then came the roar. It sounded like 100 freight trains derailing all at once. The entire crest of the mountain gave way. A blinding, churning tidal wave of white death plummeted down the sheer cliff face, accelerating with terrifying speed. "Move!" Simon grabbed Abigail by the waist, hurling them both backward into the dark, reinforced maw of the drainage tunnel they had escaped from just hours prior. Outside, Josiah Sterling screamed, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the catastrophic roar of the avalanche. The tidal wave of snow, ice, and uprooted pine trees slammed into the floor of the ravine, obliterating everything in its path. The impact shook the tunnel so violently that dirt and rocks rained down on Simon and Abigail. They huddled in the absolute dark, Simon using his massive frame to shield her from the debris, as the mountain roared its terrible justice. The silence that followed the avalanche was not merely the absence of sound, it was a heavy, suffocating physical weight pressing down from all sides. It was the silence of a slate wiped completely clean by the violent hand of God. In the pitch-black confines of the collapsed drainage tunnel, I lay pinned beneath Simon, feeling the rapid, shallow rise and fall of his chest. Dirt and pulverized rock rained down on us, filling my mouth with the bitter taste of crushed earth. But Simon didn't move. He kept his massive frame arched over mine, a human shield against the mountain's fury. "Simon?" I choked out, the dust clawing at my throat. "Are we alive?" A low, painful groan rumbled deep in his chest. "We are, but we're buried." It took us 3 agonizing hours to dig our way out. The darkness was absolute, breeding a terrifying claustrophobia that threatened to paralyze me entirely. But the sound of Simon's breathing growing wetter and more labored by the minute pushed the panic aside. I dug with a feral desperation, my raw fingers tearing at frozen roots and jagged stones, breaking my nails down to the quick. Simon worked beside me with his one good arm, his strength clearly failing him. When my hands finally broke through the packed earth and a blinding shaft of sunlight pierced the gloom, I sobbed with relief. We hauled ourselves out of the ruined earth and collapsed onto the surface. I blinked against the harsh morning glare, shielding my eyes as I looked out over the ravine. It was completely gone. In its place was a smooth, sweeping valley of pristine, glittering white. There was no sign of Deacon Miller, there was no sign of the hired guns, and there was no sign of Josiah Sterling, or his magnificent black horse. The Silver Baron's unimaginable wealth, his cruelty, and his absolute certainty that he owned the world had meant absolutely nothing to the unforgiving power of the Bitterroot Range. The mountain had swallowed them whole. Suddenly, Simon's knees buckled. He pitched forward into the snow, his strength finally deserting him. He lay there, his breathing terrifyingly shallow, his face deathly pale beneath the soot and grime. "Simon!" I dropped beside him, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. My hands frantically checked the makeshift bandage on his side. It was completely soaked through, the crimson stains spreading stark and terrifying against the snow. Panic, sharp and icy, pierced my chest. I had survived the blizzard, the brutal bounty hunters, and the earth-shattering avalanche. I refuse to let this mountain take him from me now. I've got you, I whispered fiercely, grabbing his heavy arm and hauling it over my shoulder. My muscles screamed in protest, but I forced myself to stand, pulling him up with me. You carried me out of the snow, Simon Boone. Now it's my turn. For 2 torturous days, I dragged, carried, and willed him through the endless wilderness. The refined society girl who had fainted in drawing rooms back east was entirely dead, buried somewhere beneath the avalanche. In her place was a woman forged by frost and blood. I hunted snowshoe hares with his heavy Colt revolver, the recoil bruising my wrist black and blue. I built fires in the hollows of ancient, lightning-struck cedars, and I packed his festering wound with pine pitch to stop the bleeding skills I had learned simply by watching him survive. On the 3rd day, utterly exhausted, my boots worn through and my stomach hollow with hunger, we stumbled out of the dense timberline. Below us lay the small, bustling logging camp of Orofino. The townsfolk, shocked by the sight of a bloodied, half-conscious mountain man being held up by a fierce, soot-stained woman, rushed up the trail to our aid. It took a full month for Simon to heal. He spent it in a small, cedar-lined room above the local apothecary, drifting in and out of fevered sleep. I never left his side. I traded the last ruined remnants of my emerald velvet cloak for warm, practical clothes and medical supplies. I learned to change his heavy dressings, to brew willow bark tea for his fever, and to recognize the subtle, comforting changes in his breathing. One crisp morning, with the first true signs of spring melting the heavy snow off the shingled roofs of Orofino, Simon finally sat up in a wooden rocking chair by the window. I was across the room pouring hot water from an iron kettle into a ceramic basin. I could feel his gaze on me steady, intense, and profoundly warm. "You didn't have to stay, Abigail," Simon said. His voice was still a bit rough, like gravel underfoot, but steady and strong. "Sterling is gone. The debt is buried under 50 feet of ice. You're free. You could go back east. Live the life you were meant to." I stopped pouring. The steam curled lazily into the morning air. I set the iron kettle down on the stove and turned to face him. Walking slowly across the room, I stopped directly in front of his chair. The sunlight caught the deep scars on his face, the gray of his eyes clear as a summer storm. "The life I was meant to live," I said softly, reaching out. I gently traced the rugged, scarred line of his jaw with my fingertips, feeling the rough stubble against my skin. That life started the day a stubborn mule named Barnaby stopped in a snowdrift. Simon looked up at me, the tension in his broad shoulders melting away. He reached up, his massive, calloused hand covering mine, pressing my palm firmly against his cheek. He closed his eyes for a brief second, leaning into my touch. "I don't have a cabin anymore," Simon murmured, a ghost of a smile touching the corners of his lips. "Just an empty patch of mountain and a whole lot of rebuilding to do." I smiled back, leaning down until my forehead rested against his. I could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart through his cotton shirt. The memory of that terrifying night in his cabin rushed back to me, my fearful, desperate confession, and the fierce, unyielding vow he had made to me in the flickering dark. "I told you once that I had never shared a bed," I whispered, my lips brushing gently against his, "and you made me a promise, Simon Boone." Simon's arms wrapped securely around my waist, pulling me down into his lap. He buried his face in the warmth of my neck, breathing in the scent of lye soap and the sweet, undeniable reality of my presence. "I reckon I did," the mountain man whispered back, his voice vibrating against my skin, holding me as if I were the only treasure the wilderness had ever given him, forever. Did the thrilling conclusion of Simon and Abigail's frontier romance leave you breathless? If you love this tale of survival, justice, and finding true love in the untamed Wild West, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more epic, real-life, inspired storytelling. Your support helps us bring more captivating, dramatic, historical adventures to you.